So, you've been betrayed by someone, and so you fall into that underworld of doubt about everything. And it's a serious place to be in that underworld, because not only do you not know where you came from or who you are or where you're going, that's bad enough. So that's the underworld itself. But there's a subdivision of the underworld, like the worst suburb, which is, I think, what hell is, essentially, from a metaphysical perspective. Because, if someone really cuts you off at the knees, especially if they do it in a malevolent way, and if you're going to be betrayed, and you really want to be betrayed properly, you want to be betrayed by someone who's really out to hurt you. They just weren't being stupid. They were like after you for whatever reason. And then that's also, you plunge into that underworld space, and that's also when you start to nurse feelings of resentment and aggrievement and murder and homicide, and even worse, because if people are betrayed enough, they start to obsess about the utility of being itself, and perhaps go to places that no one would ever want to go if they were in their right mind, and to develop and nurse fantasies of the ultimate revenge. And that's a horrible place to be, and that's hell as far as I can tell. And that's why hell has always been a suburb of the underworld, because if you get plunged into a situation that you don't understand and things are not good for you anymore, it's one step from being completely confused. It's only one step from being completely confused to being completely outraged and resentful, and then it's only one step from there to really looking for revenge. And that can take you places that, well, that merely to imagine properly can be traumatic. And I've seen that happen with people many times. And I think that anybody who uses their imagination on themselves can see how that happens, because I don't imagine there's a single person in the room that hasn't nursed fairly intense fantasies of revenge, at least at one point in their life. And usually, for what appear to be good reasons. It's no picnic to get betrayed, that's for sure, and it can shake your faith in being, but if it shakes it so badly that you turn against being itself, that's certainly no solution, that's for sure. All it does is make everything that's bad even worse. So, okay, now, and God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. And so that's another fundamental separation, right? Light and darkness. Those are in some sense two of the fundamental elements of our conscious being, because of course when it's light, we're awake and conscious because we're diurnal animals, and when it's night, well, then we're asleep. And so our existence is bounded by light and darkness. We're up and alert when it's light, and that's partly because we're highly visual animals, right? Unlike most animals, because most animals use smell, we use vision. We're very strange that way. And vision is associated with enlightenment and illumination, and with the breaking of the dawn, and with the coming of the new day, and all of that. So for light to be created is associated in some sense with the emergence of conscious being. And so that's another echo of that notion. And the particular phrasing of the story also is important, because it's again that God said, right? So that's the use of that word. And that's the active element of the structure that gives order to chaos. It's something like that. So it's like the spirit of the structure manifests itself and produces the fundamental divisions of experience. That's what's being presented here. And God separated the light from the darkness. He called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And again, the fact that things are named is also very important. So you see this later with Adam, because God gives Adam the job of naming all the animals, and it's sort of like the animals don't actually exist in some sense till they're named. And that's another indication of the authors of the Bible's attempt to come to terms with the fact that our cognitive faculties and our ability to speak have something to do with the way that we cast chaotic potential into actuality, right? Because we can't really get a grip on something before we have a name for it, which is why, for example, you all have names, and everything that you encounter has to have a name, because before it has a name, it's just kind of part of the blurry background. It's something like that. And you could say it exists before it has a name, and that's true, but it's also true that it doesn't exist before it has a name. Because as soon as you give something a name, its nature changes, and you've transformed it into something that's not so much mere potential anymore, but it's at least on its way to being actuality. It's on its way to being a tool. And so the act of naming is repeated continually in the first chapters of the Bible, and the reason for that is this continued emphasis on the importance of consciousness and conscious articulation and speech. You know, and speech is really something that does separate us in an important way from animals, you know, like we haven't got very far teaching animals how to speak. The best we've managed so far is some parrots, right? There's a gray African parrot. There was one of them that got up to about a 4-year-old level, and that's mind-boggling, because like, how big is the brain of a parrot? It's like that big, and that bloody thing could talk, and so that shows you how much we know about brains. But I know they're small and all that, and we tried teaching chimpanzees to talk, and they could kind of get somewhere with sign language, especially if you started when they were young, but they don't have the capacity for language like we do, and they were never able to really pass it on to the next generation, which is obviously a critical element of really having that ability. So human beings, we've used our linguistic capacity to parse up the world in a new way and to conceptualize it in a new way. And you know, you can say that we're just like ants on this little trivial planet out on the edge of one of 100 million galaxies, and that what's happening here has no cosmic significance. But that's an arbitrary proposition, you know. I mean, we're very complicated things, and whatever's going on this planet has to do with conscious reality. And the transformations of consciousness, for all we know, might be the most important things that happen everywhere. There's no reason to consider consciousness a trivial phenomenon. I mean, it's taken 3.5 billion years for you to develop the brain that you've developed. And human beings are amazing creatures. I mean, just a casual walk through YouTube and all those crazy kids that climb cranes and do that. What's that? Yeah, parkour, man. That stuff's unbelievable, you know? I mean, human beings are crazy, crazy animals. There's almost nothing we can't do. And I'm very loath to assume that the transformations of consciousness that are described in the early stories in the biblical accounts are somehow cosmically trivial. It doesn't strike me that way, and it's certainly not self-evident. And even if they are cosmically trivial, whatever that means, the rocks don't care what you think. Well, who cares what the rocks think? First, they don't think. So I don't see why that's exactly relevant. But even if it's all the same to the cosmos, which is something that I doubt, it's certainly not just all the same to you, you know, because your consciousness has a quality and it matters. Heidegger, for example, who's a philosopher whose writing sort of influenced me post hoc, because I recreated some of the things that he had talked about in the 30s before I knew much about him. But one of the things that Heidegger said was that the fundamental element of human being, of human phenomenology, was care. He said that that's the basic essence of your being, is that you care about things. You know, and that's either negatively or positively, right? To not care about something or to hate it is still to be involved in care. And so, even if the cosmos itself is neutral with regards to our existence, we're not, and we're the only things that we know of that are conscious, and so, well, we might as well go with that. And there's no reason. See, I can't help but think that the constant attempts by people to trivialize the nature of their own consciousness has a dark side. I'm a psychoanalyst, and so I always think that way. It's like, well, first of all, if you as a being don't matter, then you don't have to do anything. It's a great justification for total lack of responsibility, and that really twigs something for me, because, you know, people who are bent, let's say, or vengeful or angry are always looking for a reason why they don't have to be responsible for anything. Plus, it's a lot easier. And so the notion that consciousness is trivial immediately allows you to wander down that path. And so I'm skeptical of those claims. And I also think that there's a deep hatred of humanity that underlies those claims as well. And I read my YouTube comments sometimes, you know, and I've always been annoyed that, you know, because I've heard like sort of radical, clueless environmentalists say things like the planet would be better off without people on it, which is something that, like, you just cannot say that. If you say that and listen to yourself, you should like go to a monastery for like 3 years and never say a word and have a shower every 10 minutes until you've learned your lesson properly. You know, you can't utter a more genocidal phrase than that, you know. And of course you always do it in a display of your care for the world. It's like, well, if we just didn't have any people, it's like, well, we'll just line them all up and shoot them with machine guns. No, it's really sickening. It's appalling. And there's a hatred for humanity that's at the bottom of it. And I mean, you can kind of understand why, because we're messy and, you know, we don't clean up after ourselves. And, you know, we're like raping the rainforests and that sort of thing. But I do have some sympathy for people because, you know, we're hell on Mother Nature, but she certainly returns the favor. So, and that's a good thing to remember. You know, a lot of what we're doing is just bloody well trying to exist with a relative minimum of pain. And we're doing our best to get, you know, to get as good at doing that as fast as we can. And that's not an easy thing. There are lots of us, and like life is bloody complicated. And the other thing that happens too is, again, if you scratch just beneath the surface of people, and this is something that's always, you know, to me has been a kind of miracle, is if you talk to someone, they're out doing their job, and maybe they're doing a good job at it, like some emergency room nurse, you know, it's, God, there's a job for you. Or maybe they work in palliative care. You know, and you talk to them and you find out they've got like 4, as I said before, serious problems in their family, and maybe they're diabetic to boot, and yet they haul themselves out of bed in the morning and go take care of dying people. It's like, good God, people deserve a bit of respect for struggling forward and not always trying to make the planet a worse place when they're beset on all sides constantly by, you know, an unending series of tragedy. You'd think we could have a little bit of sympathy for ourselves as a consequence of that. It's like we're not all like rapacious, greedy monsters who are bent on just devouring everything in our path, you know. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So